Good evening, everyone. I am Tara-Lee Hedrick, and I am thrilled to welcome you tonight virtually to the Wichita Art Museum. We have a special evening planned with conservator Beren Emery, who will give us a behind-the-scenes look at her job conserving and repairing works of art in museum collections. Conservators like Beren are the doctors of the museum world. They breathe new life into dying artworks, prevent future disasters, and help protect artwork over generations. As a curator, I know that conservators work miracles and magic. Ms. Emery is speaking in conjunction with a major conservation project currently underway at WAM. Over the last 2 years, supported by federal funding from the Institute for Museum and Library Services, Beren and her colleagues from the Midwest Art Conservation Center in Minneapolis made multiple trips to Wichita. These 7 different conservators performed conservation assessments, essentially art checkups or physicals, on hundreds of works at WAM, including folk art objects from the Americana collection as some of our most special and on some of our most special and prized paintings. Some of our artworks were given a clean bill of health, while others were prioritized for treatment and are now slated for conservation. This major project was helmed by our fantastic speaker, who is the Midwest Art Conservation Center's chief conservator and senior objects conservator. Before joining the staff at MAC, Ms. Emery worked at the Cincinnati Art Museum, where she was responsible for the care and preservation of all three-dimensional objects. Although she has worked on nearly every kind of art object, Ms. Emery has extensive experience with ethnographic and archaeological materials, ceramics, lacquer, plasters, and the conservation of large-scale contemporary sculpture. She holds a master's with a certificate of advanced study in conservation, specializing in objects from the State University of New York at Buffalo, and a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. Tonight, she'll give us a sneak peek into her life as an art conservator. So please join me in welcoming Beren Emery to our screens. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara. You make it sound so glamorous and fun. I am going to share my screen so we can jump right into the presentation. And thank you all for joining us. I'm assuming you can see my screen now. So Tara was actually the one who was able to pick the title of this, and we went with the art and science of conservation. So tonight I'm going to jump right in and talk a little bit about the profession of art conservation, but how it ties in science and how we work. And I'm going to kind of break this up into a few different sessions or sections, starting with a description of the field, and then talking a little bit about MAC, the organization where I work and the type of work we do. I'm going to give you one in-depth example of conservation treatment, and then we will also talk a little bit about the project we have been working on with the Wichita Art Museum, which has been a really fun and exciting project. Art, science, or both? So here you have 2 images, one of human blood cells under a scanning electron microscope, which takes them and magnifies them by great quantities. In comparison, in contrast to study of horse, in illustration by Leonardo da Vinci. These are 2 ways where I can see art and I can see science. Back in the days of Da Vinci, he and his cohorts and his colleagues were very busy studying human body, animals, nature, the way things move, how objects are designed and how they're made and the materials that go into them. Now we have science, which is able to capture beautiful images that are as breathtaking as a work of art itself. So when it comes to art conservation, one of the reasons why I fell in love with the field is it is definitely both. The art conservation is sort of where art and science meld in the art world. Artists have this happen on a daily basis in their studios as they're mixing different materials together and working on casting bronze. It's all about a scientific experience with science of materials. However, in the art world, we really get to work on both as well. The definition of art conservation by our professional organization, the American Institute for Conservation, is the profession devoted to the preservation of cultural property for the future. Activities include examination, documentation, treatment, and preventive care supported by research and education. And tonight we're going to go through all of those different techniques and how they help aid to the way we make decisions and how we approach a work of art. One of the questions we're frequently asked is why conservation? Most people just assume we are restorers. Well, if you look in the dictionary, the definition of conservation, and now you have to get rid of natural resources here and plug in art, but it's a careful preservation and protection of something, especially planned management of art. That's where we get rid of natural resources. And it's to prevent exploitation, destruction, or neglect. In comparison, restoration is simply an act of restoring the condition or being restored. As conservators, we definitely do have restoration as a component of what we do, but as a whole, our profession is really meant to look at entire collections, individual objects, and decide not just how to restore it to what it should have been. Sometimes that's not the appropriate method. But what we want to do is really look at an object and a collection and understand how to preserve it as a whole long term. This stems from how we approach everything we do, including the materials we choose. We want everything to be as reversible as possible. This isn't always a case, but we try our best. We have scientific research into understanding the materials that we use in conjunction with work of art. And we really kind of think about this overall preservation the whole way through a treatment from start to finish. How does one become a conservator? It is typically a master's degree with a certificate advanced study in conservation. And some of the programs have it as a fine arts background, some of it's a Master of Science. To get a degree in that field, you are required to have a combination of studio art, art history, and chemistry. Actually, as the field is continuing to develop, the amount of chemistry and science is actually growing. It has been 4 semesters of chemistry, general and organic, which are each a year long of undergraduate coursework. However, they're starting to add in additional components. You also have to have a minimum of 500 hours of experience in a conservation lab working with conservators before you can even get your foot in the door. And the reason why is because it really takes a dedication and a patience. We're a very small field. There are three main graduate training programs in the United States that offer training in all of the specialties. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about what those specialties are as we go on. But those training programs each take, between those 3 programs, they take a total of 25 students each year. There are several other smaller programs, one in Canada that we count that also takes less than 10 students a year. And there's another program in UCLA that's connected with the Getty that is specific for ethnographic and archaeological objects, and they also take less than 10 students a year. And they actually only take students every other year. So you can see it's a very small field. So there's a lot of prerequisites to kind of make sure people are getting in for the right way. The Midwest Art Conservation Center is based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we are a nonprofit regional conservation lab. Our region is growing, and we love that. We are coming farther and farther south, Midwest. It's hard to define. Years ago, we were called UMCA, the Upper Midwest Conservation Center, and now that just doesn't apply. We really stretch down the center of the country. Unfortunately, I don't have an up-to-date all-staff photo because we have not all been in the same place for over a year. So it is a little bit difficult for us to gather together. However, here you've got an image of all of the staff at MAC. We have 8 full-time conservators on staff. In addition, we have a preventive conservation department, and we have our office and administrative staff and a registrar. At MAC, we have a paintings conservation department, which is comprised of 3 conservators, and the paintings conservation lab works on all materials that are painted canvas, painted panels, wall murals, including very large, so it can be acrylics, it can be oil-based, it can be tempera-based. Here you have our 3 object conservators, one working on a traditional easel panel or panel on canvas, one working on a medieval illuminated panel, and then another person working on a tear repair under the microscope. So you can see, and they've also got the center picture is a picture of the three of them stretching an incredibly large Frank Stella painting, and it takes all three of them to do something large like that. The Objects Conservation Lab, as Tara introduced, I am an objects conservator, so we work on all three-dimensional objects. It doesn't matter what the material is. We can work on, here you've got a few things. Courtney, in the top left of your screen, Courtney is working on a microscope. You can actually see what she's doing in the screen that is there. We have a microscope that allows us to actually look at it on a computer monitor. And she is actually cleaning a Moroccan piece of jewelry that has very, very tiny inlaid silver pieces. And she's working on cleaning and polishing the silver in the jewelry. All the way to, we've done mosaic ceilings in churches. You've got a picture of me working on a picture frame on an 18th century frame, to large outdoor sculpture. And the picture in the bottom right of your screen is a picture of us doing a hot wax treatment, which is actually, this is a bronze sculpture that's actually about 3 stories tall. So the conservator in this image is up on scaffolding. This is something we did a few years ago here in Minneapolis. And we actually heat up the metal and apply a wax coating that melts, and then we work it into the bronze to saturate it and also act as a protective coating. We have paper conservators on staff, 2 paper conservators on staff at the lab. Here are a few images of them at work. Again, we're always using magnification. I'll talk a little bit about that as we go on too. You've got Liz is actually in the bottom left, is actually washing works of art on paper. They are amazingly resilient. Don't try it at home. It's a very delicate task that only a conservator should try. But those are actually 2 small Rembrandt prints that she is actually washing to take some of the acidity out of the paper, take years of built up grime, and really clean the print so that it is actually in its best preserved condition. To mending tears, in painting areas of losses. And then there's also a picture of Diana looking under the microscope to identify different types of photographic print processes. We also have a textile conservator on staff. Here you've got images of Beth. Actually, the image on the right is of her working in Wichita at the Art Museum as for part of the survey, looking at a sampler. Also, doing some, in the top left, she's actually attaching another sampler to a new mounting board so that she's just stitching around the very edge, and you can see how it's stretched and packed on the side. And in the very bottom, she's working on a waterlogged textile piece. Our Preventive Conservation Department is also very important. So this is Nicole, who you can see here. Preventive conservation, as I mentioned, is when we look at the whole collection. So we want to make sure, are the light levels in the gallery appropriate? How does temperature and relative humidity affect the collection? We try to do pest management to limit the risks of pests, mice and bugs and insects. They love to graze on collection materials. We try to work on reducing the risk of biological attack, which kind of ties into temperature and humidity, by making sure that an environment is stable and appropriate for the collection material. Pollution and contaminants, this really comes into play with outdoor materials. You think of outdoor sculpture. A lot of times monuments, you'll see have what we think of as a beautiful green patination on the surface. It's usually not intentional. It's actually usually what has happened to the original patina over time as the copper corrosion products corrode and change on the surface of the bronze from pollution and air contaminants and just exposure to the elements. And amazingly, use and handling is one of the biggest dangers and risks to collection material. So this is something that we really focus on in all of our work. And MAP provides emergency preparedness services as well, and helps collections learn how to best prepare for their collection in the case of a disaster, which sadly is becoming something that's more and more important for collections as some of our natural disasters are becoming more frequently and on a larger scale. So when an object comes into the conservation lab, one of the things that we do, the very first thing, and this was mentioned in our definition of what art conservation is, we spend a lot of time doing examination and documentation. And this is really important as a way for us to look at an object, understand what its condition is, how it's aged, what materials it's made out of, how those have aged and damaged over time. Is it supposed to look like it? What is it supposed to look like? What should it be? Is something not original? And so we use some different scientific techniques to identify materials and to look at an object. The most important thing we do is visible examination. This is just looking with our eyes, sometimes with a microscope, but we can see a lot. And sometimes we use visible examination with different light sources. And I'll show you in some images and examples of that in just a moment. But we can look at things and decide, oh, what's happened to the surface? How has it changed just by different lighting conditions? We do microchemical spot testing, ultraviolet illumination, X-radiography, and infrared are three techniques that we use quite extensively. MAC has the capability of doing all on site with the exception of X-radiography. I'm dreaming of having our own X-ray unit on site. We come close and then we come far away, but we're working on it. But we do have access and a partnership locally in Minneapolis where we can have that done as needed. But sometimes we take our scientific analysis even farther and we really dig deep into what's happening. And then we get into other more complex analytical techniques. I'm not going to focus on any of those tonight, but I thought it would be interesting since we're talking about art and science and how it all combines, that we really do work with conservation scientists. There's a whole subset of our profession that focuses on this, but also that these are tools that we can use when we need to, if we need to identify something specific. So why is examination and scientific analysis important? Here you have images of Rita Berg, one of our paintings conservators, looking at, it's actually the same coronation of the Madonna that you saw in an earlier image where she was working on it. But we use this different type of examination and analysis to understand its condition, as I mentioned, learn about working methods of an artist, guide our treatment decisions and the materials we're going to use. That's really important for us. Sometimes we use it to identify new products that are used in our field. We look at what technologies can benefit. We're a small field, so we frequently rely on what's happening in the science, technology, the dental industry. What kinds of tools do they have? My dentists always roll their eyes because I sit in the chair and I ask them about, ooh, what does that do? Or, ooh, where did you get that? Because I'm always curious about where these different materials come from. So here is, just before I dive into some of our examples, this is something I found on a website that I really like because it allows you to sort of see the different layers. This is taking a painting, but it's starting with, on the left side, you've got the visible light, where I mentioned that we just use our eyes to see. Grazing light is another name that we call as raking, is more common in the United States. UV reflected, and going into the IR and X radiography. These are kind of how you can break down the different layers of a material, how we can take from something that's just on the surface and we can start to look deeper and deeper into it with some of these analytical techniques. Here we're getting into some of the real pictures and examination ideas. So this is a painting. This was not created at MAC. One of my painting colleagues gave these examples and they're absolutely fantastic, so I like to use them. It was owned by a private client, but the painting had been severely water damaged. And here you can see in the top left, this is what we call normal light. This is the photo documentation that was taken before treatment. Next to it, you have raking light. This is when we have the light coming from one side only, and it allows you to see planar definitions of an object. So you can really see how damaged the painting was. If you go to the bottom row, you see specular light. This is when we have the light shining directly at a painting, and we're watching the amount of reflection that is coming off of the surface. So this can also help us see. Transmitted light is when we put the light source behind the work of art and we allow it to shine through. In this case, with a painting in particular, and I have to say, transmitted light is really something that works best for works on canvas or textiles or some things like that. There's not very many objects that I get to use this technique with very often. But it allows the light to come through and you can see areas of damage in the canvas and where there's paint loss. In contrast, here at the top, you've got the during treatment in normal light and the after treatment in normal light. So you can see just how much of the fills. One of the reasons why we have images of the during and the after and before is because as part of our documentation, we take photographs of every step of our treatment as we go along. And this is part of its permanent record, as well as very extensive written documentation. So you've got the during treatment where the conservator has filled in all the areas of loss. And then in the after treatment normal, this is what the painting looks like after conservation. And you can compare it with the specular light before and after, and you can see how all of the planar deformations have been removed from the canvas. This is done, and I'm not going to get into it too much. If anyone has questions, I can answer them later, but I'm not a paintings conservator. But basically, they will unstretch it from its canvas, and they will work on a process of humidification and flattening, and sometimes relining if necessary in order to work it back flat, and then re-stretch it. And then, with cleaning and removing layers of dirt and grime and varnish, it really is quite a dramatic effect. This is an object that I do know much more about because I did treat this one. This is the Sandpourshare ware. Sandpourshare ceramics are fairly rare. I believe at this point there's only about 80 left in existence. And it's because it was such a fragile type of ceramic ware that was made in France. And this is an object where you've got the normal illumination, just our documentation, just as we can see it. Then you have ultraviolet illumination. So this is when we put it under UV radiation, and we are looking at what is the fluorescence, what is changed by the UV light that fluoresces. If you've ever been somewhere with a black light and like all the dust shows up on your shirt, or that something's fluorescent, something's don't. That's the same with objects. A lot of times things on an object won't fluoresce at all. In fact, on this ceramic, what you see that looks just pink, that's just normal. That is just how the object is absorbing the UV. It's so light in color that it doesn't look dark. It just shows up as sort of a pink. It's just absorbing the UV. The areas that appear to be blue or kind of a white cast, those are all old areas of repair. When it was treated, it was actually, and those are not my repairs. This is before treatment. But it was hard to tell what had happened to it and how much had been restored. They weren't sure if parts of it were non-original, and we were trying to identify more about the object and its history. So this is a clear picture where you couldn't see the overpaint on the surface. This allowed you to see exactly where all the old repairs were present. But we took it even a step farther and did X-radiography. And I believe you can see my pointer here. There is actually a break running through here. This is an area of an old repair. And you can see where in this area, this curl had broken off and they actually used a metal pin to stick it in place. So there are a few areas where you can see the repairs that were made and how it's been affected over time. Infrared is one of the other techniques like X-radiography that allows us to see in the paint layers. And this is just an example of how this technique works. So here you see Van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait, and you've got this image of his hand up in a gesture. But under infrared, you can actually see where this underdrawing is of how the artist moved the hand's position. When it was sketched out, the hand was in one spot and then it was actually shifted as he painted the composition. So this is just a few ways of how these different examination techniques allow us to look and learn about works of art, and it really does inform how we treat them. Now I'm going to jump into a case study. This is a reclining figure from 1933 by Henry Moore. And this is a project that I worked on several years ago, and it really is a great project to discuss because it kind of covers a lot of the different examination techniques and the research piece, and also is just a really exciting treatment to show because it's pretty drastic. And a lot of times the treatments that we do are not very drastic, but sometimes they are. So we'll talk about this one. So this is what it looked like before treatment. There were areas in the condition. So if you look at it, what you've got is you've got a wooden base, and then the sculpture is mounted to it, and it's reinforced concrete that had been pigmented. So this is a very heavy sculpture. It was a solid cast, so it's not hollow. It's just a solid piece of concrete. And there are areas, and you can start to see them right in this area. However, if you look at the detail, you can start to see that there are these cracks. What we knew, they had a lot, this was from the Mildred Lane Kemper Museum in St. Louis, attached to Washington University. And what we knew about the sculpture was that it had been cracked and repaired on several occasions. They had a long history of the documentation of the collection. It entered their collection in the early 1940s, and it was made in 1933. So it had a very short life outside of their collection. They had documentation of it being repaired on several times, but frequently with the documentation that was done in the early 40s, 50s, and 60s, it wasn't complete. Sometimes it's just a note. Sometimes it's just an indication of, in fact, one of the facility reports mentioned that a facilities worker stuck something back together. We'll get to that in a second. But we saw all these cracks, and we really needed to understand what was happening with the sculpture and why did it keep reoccurring. So this got into the research piece where we really had to start looking into the sculpture. So here you've got an example of some images of how it looked at different stages in its life. So the key thing here is this is actually Henry Moore's studio. And here you can see it sitting on a large pedestal. And what I want to point out in this image is that there is no wooden base underneath the sculpture. By 1934, it is difficult to tell, but we think this is the wooden base. The image was cropped in a way we can't be 100% certain because it's black and white, but we believe that is the wooden base. Here we have what it looked like in just pre-1944. This was about the time it was acquired. And then here you have it in 1946, where we clearly see that the base is on the sculpture at this time. So this is using ultraviolet illumination to start looking into what had happened and where we see different repairs. So all of these areas that are actually dark are areas of overpaint, paint that is non-original to the object that have been put on the surface to cover areas of repair. One of the things that has happened in the past was that overpaint, and we call it overpaint because they would extend the area of repair instead of just staying within it, which is what we do now. So you can see there are some areas of a fluorescent coating that's kind of fluorescing orange. That's indicative of shellac. And then these are the fills that have different, this is actually acrylic paint that's on top of those fills. And you can see how extensive they are through the base and then also the arm and the neck. Well, we had X-radiography done. Now, reinforced concrete is tricky because it's so dense that X-radiography doesn't really want to penetrate. However, you were able to see clearly the chicken wire that is described as having been used. We know that the way it was cast, that chicken wire was used as the internal armature. And then there were also some wires that were used to reinforce some of the appendages. What's not original to the piece is this large screw that is present in the neck. This is a modern screw. This is when somebody from a facilities department at the university noticed that the head was broken and reattached it themselves with a screw. The armature is also bent and cut in this area, and there are areas where the chicken wire does not go all the way through. Here you could also see a bolt that goes from the wooden base that its sculpture sits on up into the base of the object. Now we'll dive into treatment. Now that we have a little bit more understanding of what has happened to the object and where some of the old repairs are, the first step was actually to remove all of the overpaint so we could start to see what was going on underneath. And this started to reveal large fills underneath. There you can see after all of the overpaint was revealed, you can start to see the network of cracks in the neck. You can see that there's actually not that much damage in the arm where there was just a few areas of loss. You can start to see these larger fills. But what's really becoming clear is that there's an extensive large fill between the sculpture and the wooden base. And the cracks are running through this. Here we're starting to actually remove the fill material so we can see what's going on. And if you notice, there we go. So if you notice here, this fill material extends just like the overpaint significantly onto the original material. This is actually mostly original material that's just been a little scratched up. So what they did again was they just covered this whole area. So you can also start to see that these breaks really do extend all the way through. When working on the side, we started to notice that there is an extensive amount of restoration fill on one end of the sculpture and that the entire original surface had been covered. We're also discovering as we remove that bottom layer of fill that there is another plaster fill underneath the sculpture, adding an extra like 3/4 of an inch of height to the sculpture. So now you can start to see as we're taking more and more off that this is a plaster fill, is actually raising the sculpture up, and it had been inpainted and overpainted to make it look like the entire height of the sculpture went right to the base of the deck. So here again, you can see that if you look in this image, the base of the sculpture was actually narrower in appearance than what it turned out to be. So at this point in the treatment, we realized that we had to take it fully off of its base. And this was partially because we needed to actually treat it and it was secured in a way that we couldn't move it. But also this base had been on since the 1940s and all of the repairs that had happened had been done on top of the base. So we needed to take it off because actually the base was a very thin wood structure that was hollow and it would actually bend a little bit and have a little warp and flex. And the sculpture was moving with it, which was part of the reason why that base continued to crack. So this is what I found when I took it off. We removed the bolts and took it off, and it turned out that the entire bottom had been covered in plaster and the sculpture set. In addition to the bolts that they used, they literally plastered the concrete sculpture to the base, which then you have a third layer of material that is responding to moisture and humidity in a different way. You've got the wood expanding and contracting, you've got the plaster doing something underneath, and you have the concrete. And when any of them move or shift, they're all doing something different, which is part of the reason why it's contributed to these different repair campaigns. Also, because when it was moved, this much plaster had actually stayed secured to the base. So it was obvious that at some point people had just been pouring plaster in to try to fill and try to redo some of the repairs by just adding more plaster. So the next phase of the treatment was actually to mechanically remove all of the repairs and completely disassemble it. This is where I say this treatment is pretty extensive. This is not something we find ourselves doing very often. I always joke that when I have a chisel out, I know I mean serious business because it's not very often that we use chisels on work of art. Remember, we're being very gentle and trying to do everything to harm as little as possible. But all of that old material had to come off and we had no other method. In this process, we also began slowly removing all of the other old repairs. Here you can see areas where newspaper chunks had been stuck in with the plaster. Unfortunately, none of them were V8. We couldn't see exactly when those were from. You can also see the extent of adhesive that had been poured into some of the cracks at different times. And this was a shellac-based adhesive, which does not necessarily hold up long over time. These were all pieces that had been broken off with poured plaster fragments in areas of loss. And here you've got it when it was pretty much taken apart and held together with clamps so that it more wouldn't fall apart. But you can see how much, so the physical body, you need to understand, the physical body of the sculpture, still lying on its side, was still in one piece. It's the base. It's that long rectangular base that was in such bad condition. So the actual physical sculpture was pretty secure. It's just lying on its back on a custom mount at this point. There, you can see it. You can see exactly what it looks like at this point. So we're trying to keep it in plane, trying to keep everything together as we continue to work on the sculpture. And then the next project, after we took everything apart, cleaned it all, figured out what was happening over time, now it was time to do more appropriate fills and really put the object back together, hopefully for many, many years to come. So we used a structural adhesive to actually rejoin all of those brittle pieces of concrete back together. You can see how they're going back together. This brown material is that structural adhesive. Then we start to fill, and you can notice that my fills stay only in areas of loss. They do not extend onto the original material. This is the process where you can see the underlayer fill, the structural fill, and then this is the non-structural but more plaster fill. And here you can see it as the areas of loss of everything's been put back together, the sculpture's been stood upright, and it's all coming back again. One of the things that we did at this phase of the treatment was actually to make a new base. The decision was that we know that that base was causing harm. We do not believe it was original to the object. It is possible that Henry Moore knew the kind of hypothesis that came up, and we did work with the Henry Moore Foundation during this process, but the hypothesis was that the sculpture base was so large and heavy but had a lot of thin areas that most likely in the process of moving it between different venues and galleries early in its life, it probably broke. The artist did not make the repair or mount it to the base, but it's likely he knew it was happening and was okay with it. But the foundation, we all agreed it wasn't doing any good, and it was sort of ugly, and it was changing the way the sculpture was meant to be viewed. So we went with something different that was more passive. So what we did was we actually protected the entire bottom of the sculpture. This is what it looked like before I started in painting the fills, but we left it so you could visually see where the structural fills were very clearly. This is all original material. These are the surface fills. And we created an epoxy mount. So I covered it in plastic wrap, and we pushed this epoxy clay on top of the surface and then set it down flat and allowed it to sink and settle into all the crevices. So it custom fit. So what this little illustration represents was that this is where the epoxy fits up into all those voids, supporting every inch of the bottom of the sculpture. We then removed the sculpture, so then took off that plastic wrap, so it was not permanently affixed, but we did permanently attach that epoxy mount to a stainless steel plate that was very heavy. And then we're able to set the sculpture back on top. So now it has a really rigid, non-flexible base that's completely unattached. All you would have to do is lift the sculpture up, but it sinks into these grooves and it really supports it very well, so it can't slide or shift off. And then what we did, and it looks like I didn't include very many pictures of the in-painting process, I'm sorry, but we went through and in-painted all those little areas of loss to blend in and look like the original material. Again, not covering the original material, but showing it very closely too. And here we can also see how what we decided to do, and this was in conjunction with the curator, we toned the base in order to look as if it is not part, but not to be visually distracting. Some people comment that they notice that it's of a different dimension, and that is because the actual original is of a different dimension. It's thinner on one side as it gets to the other, and what we wanted was the top of the sculpture to sit level, and so that is why we created that. So this surface is pretty close to level, but it's this surface that you've got it level in the base, and so you had to kind of compensate for that difference. And there's the back as well. One thing we did decide to do is leave small little voids and little losses that we did not feel were visually distracting, but again, show more of the history of the object. So now as we come closer to the end of the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about object by object surveys. As Tara mentioned, the Wichita Art Museum received a large IMLS funded grant for us to do an object by object survey. And this is a really great thing for any institution to carry out. And we were really happy and supportive and really proud to be part of this project. It was really an honor for us as well. So in total, there were 5 conservators who came on site. Actually, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 conservators who came on site of all the different specialties: textile, paper, works of art on canvas, and also 3-dimensional objects. And we looked at the objects together in the collection that were selected for us, focusing mostly on the Americana collection. So here you can see Beth, our textile conservator, looking at a sampler. This is Alexa looking closely at a painting, really trying to understand what's going on. When we come in and do an object by object survey, our goal is to look at the objects up close and personal and get a really good understanding in a quick manner that we can help the institution gauge what the conservation priorities are going forward. How can we help them choose what items are more priority for treatment, and we work on this together with a curatorial priority. Which ones are more likely to be on display? Which ones have the most historical significance? All museum collections have objects in the basement that may never come out, but they're great for education and historic purposes. They're meant to be saved. They're great to have in a collection for research purposes, but they may not be where you want to have it flashy and out on display. And that's when you want to preserve the whole collection. We also provide recommendations in the survey on storage mounts, environment, what kinds of things should change, what are the light levels should be. So we look at all of these different things. Here are a few things. All of these are objects in the Wichita Art Museum collection. Here you can see I'm measuring a chair to get the dimensions. My colleague Courtney is examining a weather vane. Here are some of my favorite objects that I saw. This is a great case where the object has had a rough history with pests. It has had many little bugs eating its way through. The object is still good and stable, but its garments need some work. And this is a case where going forward, we would actually work in conjunction with the objects and the Textile Conservator in order to carry out. You have a weather vane with some corrosion issues that we want to address. And then you have the amazing decoy collection. And this was one of my favorites, this goose that had some breaks in some areas of flaking paint. So we really got to go in and look carefully at the collection and help prioritize. When we do that, in total, between the 7 conservators, we looked at 492 objects. This top image right here is what you see. This is the documentation we provide for all 492 objects that we surveyed. It is a very detailed 2-page survey form that has a few small snapshots, sort of a checkbox format of what the condition issues are, and sort of the basic recommendations for how should it be stored, how should it be handled, what its condition issues are that should be noticed, and its treatment recommendations. And then how big of a treatment or how small of a treatment it may be. We then, working with the staff of the Wichita Art Museum, came up with the top 55 objects. And that's all of the objects surveyed, not just the 3-dimensional objects, but that includes the paintings and textiles. And each of those 55 or those top picks were then given a full proposal for treatment, which is when we take this information, this from the survey that we did of all the objects, and we go more in depth and really write out step by step what needs to happen in the future in order to preserve the object and how we can do that. And then all of this documentation, a whole lot of paperwork, gets turned back to the Wichita Art Museum in order for them to decide what their priorities are. And so this has been a really great opportunity for us to learn more about the collection and for us to work together. And we've really been enjoying the process, and we look forward to hopefully doing some treatment in the future. And with that, I will say thank you very much, and I will stop sharing my PowerPoint, but I am happy to answer any questions you have, and please feel free.
Megan, that was incredible. I hope everyone gets a sense of how much fun it is to do this, how marvelous it is to work with you all, with the MAC conservators when they come, and just a pleasure. I expect folks to start asking questions in the chat, but while we wait for those to start to come through, talk to us a little bit about the history of conservation in the 20th century, because it's so interesting when you look at these objects that some of the problems are time, and some of them are silly artists, and some of them are past conservation. So do you think, just tell us a little bit about the history of conservation. Do you think we're making choices now that people will be happy with 75 years from now, or do you think they'll be cranky with us like you're cranky with some of those folks who worked on the Henry Moore sculpture?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really good question. And I think that as long as artwork has been produced, so going back to cave paintings, it has been restored. when you can't make art and then have it last forever without somebody intervening at some time. And so it's been different approaches. I mean, you hear stories about how, the Sistine Chapel, I can't even speak, but how the chapel ceiling was cleaned with bread and vinegar years and years ago, after 100 years of it being on the ceiling. So there's all sorts of things, and our field is continuing. The actual field of art conservation really didn't develop until the 60s. And that's when it became more of a dedicated profession. Museums in the United States had conservation labs as early as the 30s, but it really didn't there weren't graduate programs and everything until the 60s. Those didn't become popular until the 80s, even the 90s. It was always apprentice training. And our field continues to evolve. And we're getting more scientific in some ways. And that's helping a lot. But we are still learning that 10 years ago, this varnish that we thought was like the best, most stable thing. Well, all the aging tests we did 10 years ago didn't show what really happens in 10 years, and that it cross-links and it becomes difficult to remove. So we're going to continue to do that. I'm not going to lie. The majority of what I do is repairing something that somebody else has already repaired. And that's just the way it is. And contemporary art and modern art, there are some inherent vice. There's a lot of inherent vice. Some of the oldest objects actually are in the best condition because they just were made really well. And with, chocolate, butter, food products, things that aren't meant to be in art are now in art. And so we'll just continue to figure it out.
Fantastic. Okay, well, Megan, I'm going to start asking you a couple of questions from the chat.
Okay.
Linda Winter asks, how did you restore the corrosion on the weather vane?
We haven't had the opportunity to do so yet. However, that is one of the treatments that we hope would possibly happen in the future. But the way we would approach that is we want it to visually look the same. Historic folk art material is actually treated very differently than something like Emery, which is considered a decorative art sculpture. And so we would want it to look just like it looks now, but to be clean and stable and not actively corroding. So what we would do is we would use specific solvents to that material, and we would clean years of dirt and grime, and any active corrosion we would try to mechanically remove if possible, or we would use some sort of and again, without talking about the specific objects, since we haven't treated it yet, we would actually try to pacify the corrosion or make it stable going forward. We also then provide recommendations for, well, this object should always be in a really stable environment. The Wichita Art Museum has one of the best climates in the building that I have seen in a lot of institutions. You should be very proud of your museum. They have done a lot of hard work on having a great climate system to maintain their collection. But when it goes traveling or other places, they'll want to consider what the environment is that it's in, not aggravate or cause other problems. That's the question. That's the answer for that. To be continued.
Fantastic, Megan. Timothy Reimer asks, how many hours of work went into the Moore sculpture? That's a great question.
A lot, several hundred. It's difficult because we'll say several hundred, but it also takes, I worked on it for over a year. We have many projects going on at the same time, so it's not like I just sat down and cranked it out in a few days or a few weeks. But it was about a year and a half worth of work and probably around 200 hours. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow. So this is a great question. This is a question about our own WHAM IMLS project. Can you tell us what some of the 55 items are that need conservation?
You're going to put my memory to the test. It's a combination of everything. So that covers all of the different specialties. And so I really can't speak for, I think there was about 20 some of those that were for three-dimensional objects. So some of the weather vanes, you have a really great collection of weather vanes, some of the dolls. There were some flag poles that were really great. I'm trying to think some of the toys, some of the unique toys that are in the collection, and children's, like a push buggy, and some of the rocking horses. Basically, if you kind of look in the folk art gallery and you'll see, or the Americana gallery, you'll see sort of a snapshot of the different types of objects. And pretty much we found something of all of those that could use something. A lot of it is in really good condition. A lot of it doesn't need things. You know, the number one thing we find is dirt and grime and just the buildup of things. And that's the nature of material that's been around for a long time that hasn't been addressed by conservation. And flaking paint on folk art is particularly susceptible to flaking paint because a lot of it is not made by trained artists and they're using the materials that they have or can find. And so we find that a lot of times on the painted wood objects or some of the painted metal that we've got flaking paint issues.
Great. Megan, I have another question for you. Can you talk to us about the project in your career you're most proud of? Yeah.
That's tough. I don't know. It changes all the time.
Okay.
I think one of the projects that I think comes to mind first today is, and this was a group project, and I was one of the co-project managers of the project, and that is the Bell Museum of Natural History as part of the University of Minnesota. And, oh, sorry. Little dog hazard. She's been quiet the whole time.
She's doing great. She's doing great.
So the Bell Museum of Natural History was actually relocating their facility from one old historic building, but that was no longer able to be made to code, or it just was not possible to keep it going as a functional museum. They had way too many problems with water infiltration and everything. They have an amazing collection of huge, large-scale dioramas. And a huge team of people was involved in moving those dioramas to their brand new museum in St. Paul. And we were part of that. And what our max responsibility was the painted background of the big full-size. They were 35 feet long and 16 feet high. And there were these huge curved walls that had to literally be disassembled in pieces, cut into pieces, and moved across and reassembled and put back together again. It was a massive project that took about 2 years. It took 10 years of planning prior to the project. And all conservators at MAC worked on it, every specialty. And it was really just a really fascinating project to work on. So that's probably my answer to that question.
Yeah, spectacular. Spectacular. Really wonderful. Well, Megan, we have another question for the chat.
Okay.
Someone's asking about your personal history. How did you become interested in conservation? And I always love this question too, because I always think when I'm with conservators, I know a lot of people who love art and who are great at making art, but most of the people I know who love art are also not good at chemistry. So I love hearing about the backgrounds of conservators because it does, there's this scientific technological piece as well as this artistic piece.
Mm-hmm. We all come at it from a different background, but I had a love of art and art history, and I like science. I loved biology and like the human body and nature and that aspect of it. I wasn't a big fan of chemistry. In fact, I was quite disappointed that I had to do chemistry. However, I realized I wanted to do hands-on work. I wanted to work with art. I was not that skilled at being that creative. I have studio art background. I love studio art. I love to play with the materials, but let's just say I'm crafty. I'm not that creative. I can copy something great. I can't come up with anything on my own. And I wanted to be in a museum, but I didn't just want to study. No offense, Tara. I wanted to be working with it and fixing it and do more than just learn about it. And that's what you do. So it was a combination of art and science. I figured out that was an option, art conservation, and I fell in love with the idea, and it has been the perfect fit.
Fantastic. Well, Megan, thank you so much. We will let you go. Thank you so much for this presentation, and hopefully in the future we'll have another one where we talk about some of the conservation that happens on works of art in Wham's collection, and so we can have a part 2. Yeah,
that sounds great. Hey, you know what? Another question came into the chat that I actually really want to answer.
Oh,
Is that
okay, great.
okay?
Oh, yeah. No, yes. More questions have come into the chat. I should have looked over. Yes. Thank you.
No, there was a question regarding from Elaine Baker about where to bring an oil or acrylic painting in Wichita. I actually can't answer that. I'm afraid I don't know in Wichita area. I will say we take private work from all over the place, but it has to come to us. So that's one thing. But I'm sorry I can't answer that one off the top of my head. The question about what's my opinion on golden paint products and what is the best way to make it archival from Heather Powell. Golden paint, and I'm not, I cannot endorse any product, but we use golden paints all the time. Golden Paint is one company that has spent a lot of time working with conservators and doing the very best to make their paints as stable as possible. They're also willing to work with an artist, and if somebody has a problem, they're willing to go through the science and work with them. I have worked with their conservator, with their paint chemists a lot, and they're fantastic. So I would say, and they are always striving to be as archival as possible. Acrylic paint is not perfect, no matter what kind it is. However, it is a very stable product, and we use golden paints all the time. So I would say that's a good company to work with. And a lot of it, they have some good literature on their website about what products are more archival than others.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, again, Megan, just thank you so much. Thank you for, we've just had so much fun on this journey together. And thank you for sharing a bit about the magic of conservation with us here at WAM.
Absolutely. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Great. Next time in person. Okay.
Absolutely. You got it.
Thank you.
Thanks.